Welcome to the Inside Eco Devo podcast, where we highlight economic development happening in the state of Missouri. I'm your host, Eric Thurman, with the Missouri Department of Economic Development. On this episode, we're continuing our discussion about Missouri's Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, also known as CEDS. And we're going to be diving into industry clusters. We highlighted this on episode 1, and now we're going to be getting more into it. Sitting down with me in the studio to help with this discussion is Jeff Pinkerton. He's DED's Director of Economic Research, and Stefan Herron. He's DED's Strategy and Policy Analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
These intros are getting very long with all of these big names that we have.
All the acronyms.
So I think from here on out, we'll just refer to the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy as CEDS. Save everyone a lot more time.
Love it.
But as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about industry clusters, and I think we can just jump right into it by just talking about what is an industry cluster. When we say that, what are we referencing? What are we talking about?
Simply, when we're talking about industry clusters, we're talking about groups of related businesses that gain a competitive advantage from being near each other. So in a sense, it's a very physical, like geographical thing, where these businesses are sharing resources, and those can be suppliers, a workforce, infrastructure. Universities are often a key resource that these, like businesses share, and they gain an advantage from having that. So I think when you think about industry clusters, there's some real world examples that most of us know, like Silicon Valley in California, the tech app cluster. Also, like in Boston, MIT, the robotics industry cluster. And so those are all businesses that are related to each other, and it can be competitively or cooperatively. You can have businesses that share a lab or a space and share their research with each other, or it can just be a competitive thing where these businesses naturally want to be in a city or a region or a state because they have that region, that geography has the workforce, resources, supplies that just naturally makes those businesses competitive, and them being competitors with each other and being so close offers them advantages. So in a sense, it's a very geographical thing about this interconnectedness. Kind of a jargony would be like, it's called co-locating. They're geographically close to each other.
In terms of Missouri's economy, how do industry clusters support, raise, lower, impact in any way Missouri's economy?
Well, I think when you look at Missouri's economy, one of the things that stands out is it's extremely diverse. As a matter of fact, there's out of the University of Utah, there's a Hatchman index that measures this thing, and Missouri is the most diverse state economically in the country. So generally, we don't have a particular industry that's driving things forward. That could be a good thing, because if there's an industry maybe that's struggling right now, we probably have another industry that's doing well and balancing things out. So in general, in an economy like ours, our highs are not as high, our lows, however, are not as low. So there's that middle ground. What I think we sacrifice from being a diverse economy is having those drivers, is having those unique industry clusters that can really come together, be in the right market, and really drive your economy forward. So I think that's why I think doing this research, looking at these industry clusters, trying to identify these industries and what we can do to foster them is important. We don't want to dismiss our diverse economy, but we do want to see if we can identify some of those clusters that are growing and can help drive our economy forward. And when certain industries in Missouri are doing well, that, as Stefan said, that bleeds out into others, and the kind of a rising tide lifts all ships. So I think focusing on these clusters, identifying these clusters, and working to grow them would really benefit Missouri as a whole. And another thing that we focus on, these industries are in the traded sector. And what we mean by that is these are businesses that could locate anywhere. So for instance, an idea of a local sector, so there's traded in local sector, an example of a local sector would be like hospitals. Hospitals are going to locate where the population is a certain size. Retail is going to locate, if there's a market there, they're going to locate. But so those are going to pop up where there's a population need for that. But an automobile plant could locate anywhere. So those don't have to be located in your state or your region, but if they are, you do reap the benefits of that. So I think that's another aspect of this, is looking at those traded sector industries that can help drive our entire economy.
And when we pull it back to CEDS, Looking at industry clusters, how does this impact CEDS on how we formulate the strategy? And then a kind of a part two to that question is, why look at industry clusters for CEDS other than some other kind of parameter that we could be looking at or using?
I think to answer that second question first, like why look at industry clusters at all? Because there's been a lot of research around industry clusters. When I first started, Jeff and I, we did a lot of research on industry clusters, read a lot of Michael Porter, who's like the godfather of industry clusters out of like Harvard. He's written a lot of research papers on like why these are important. I think one of the cool aspects of industry clusters is what they call like knowledge spillover. And that when you have these interconnected industries and that, you know, Eric, your point about even if they're not the exact same industry or businesses, they still share workers. Well, if you think about a manufacturing community in Missouri or in any other state, and they are trying to innovate and they're trying to get more research and commercialization for their manufacturing base, and they have to train their workers more, and therefore they have to pay them more, and then their competitors will want to do the same, so they raise their pay, and then workers go to the other business, and then those workers who are now really well trained are helping that new business gain information and knowledge, as well as, you know, the universities that are really close to those industry clusters will start targeting, you know, the best ways to train students and workers that best fit those industry needs. So having that knowledge spillover, that kind of natural mechanism that helps these industries be more productive, be more innovative. Really, we see that in economies where industry clusters are really strong. We see wages go up. We see productivity go up. So that means that businesses are creating more expensive, better things relative to the amount of work that's put into them. We see, you know, relative like GDP go up and, like I said, wages. So they're really important for an economy. So when we're looking at the CEDS and the research, and I know Paul mentioned on episode 1 that this is not the only research that we're doing. We've done a number of other research initiatives, but when we looked at industry clusters, we saw that there was a great opportunity, to Jeff's point about how we're so diverse, that thinking about industry clusters and identifying them in Missouri can be a great way to find those target industries in our diverse economy and kind of reap those benefits or really push those benefits of an industry cluster, of that specialization, productivity, higher wages, better jobs. And industry clusters are often really forward-looking, right? We want to look at industry clusters that, like I said, innovative and that are filling a need that's global. And a CEDS is a forward-looking document. It's a 5-year plan and something that's continually updated. So it felt right to have industry clusters be a part of the CEDS. And as Danielle talked about in episode 1, there's, you know, much more that goes into a CEDS. It's more comprehensive than that. But that's definitely why industry clusters were kind of identified as something that can really be a strength for our state.
I might be distilling this down a little too simply, so correct me if I'm wrong. The industry clusters probably, from what I'm hearing, kind of give maybe not the best, but in the context of what we're talking about, one of the best views of the economy, of the direction, how strong we are, where we could go, where we're lacking, where we could be stronger, all that stuff. So maybe that's why that's a good place to mine data and use for the strategy, or am I misreading?
I don't know if I'd say it's the best view of our economy, but it's kind of, as Jeff said, it's very targeted, and it's right. Looking at these specific industries and how they are, of course, because industry clusters then impact the industries around them. So it's just very targeted.
Yeah, I would agree. We part of this process, we got to go around and talk with economic development leaders throughout the state, and there was a little bit of, I won't say pushback, but there was some, hey, what about we were in the Southeast, and what about agriculture? Agriculture is our bread and butter, so to speak. And when we were down in, we were in Kansas City, people were talking to us about, well, our healthcare industry is huge and a big driver for our region, as is like engineering. So we heard people talking about their local economic strengths, and those are great, and we're not saying anything about them. But what we were identifying with these clusters were industries that are maybe perhaps under the radar, have higher productivity, higher wage jobs and are in those traded sectors that have customers around the globe, as Stefan just mentioned, that bring dollars into our community, where healthcare primarily, it's your customer is usually pretty local. Agriculture was kind of a different one because our Missouri's economy has long been based on agriculture. And when we get into the clusters, we'll see that agriculture is really there in those clusters. It's just not its own cluster, but it's a part of bio. It's a part of, food and beverage manufacturing. It's there. It's just not necessarily, we're not talking about it at a blanket as agriculture as a whole. It permeates a lot of different things.
Gotcha. I'm glad you brought up the tour and some of the things that you guys heard during that time. We'll definitely dive into that. Before we get to that, though, just a little bit more of kind of how we're getting to where we're at the moment. During the peer state review, were you guys seeing if other states were using our strategy that we're doing, looking at industry clusters? And if so, how are we comparing there? How are they using it differently than us? Kind of any similarities or differences between that if other states are using industry clusters? Or if they're not, what are they using that we could have?
No, that's a really good point. And a big part of my job is looking at other states in the peer state comparison and also just across the country and the strategies that they're using in economic development. And we have peer states that, they'll call them target sectors, target industries, target industry clusters. Those kind of definitions get lost or changed. But at the end of the day, we do. There are states, I think notably like Michigan, Ohio, are very public about, hey, here are our 6 industries, target industries. Whether they define them as clusters, I don't know. But that's definitely something we see from a lot of states about what are the drivers in their economy and how can, if they target them, what can they do to bolster them?
And then in terms of some, comparisons, where do we stand? Where do we fall? We'll get into like the specific industry clusters, but in general, where are we kind of measuring up with our peer states?
In terms of,
well, I'm trying to be vague before we get into like the industry clusters. Maybe we'll jump there and then maybe come back to this. But out of the industry clusters that we've looked at, and then the ones that we've selected,
generally, I'll just talk about employment as a whole. Yeah. I mean, Missouri, we are a hot market right now. As we're sitting here in mid-November, we have data through October of 2024. Over that last year, I believe we ranked 6th in the country in terms of employment growth. So Missouri's economy is pretty strong right now, and employment growth has been great. And we'll talk more about the industry clusters here, but there are some industries that we're doing particularly well in that mesh with what we've kind of found when we were identifying these clusters and driving us.
And Jeff, I was also something that we're really strong in, and this is data you've talked about, but particularly, and it's kind of as a lead into the kinds of clusters that we're looking at, as manufacturing. And that through this research and what Jeff does is Missouri is exceptionally strong in manufacturing. Yep. That's representative of our clusters. And I think if we're going to compare to other states, that's definitely something that we have a strength in relative to the country, is just our really strong manufacturing sector.
I think we're dancing around the clusters quite a bit. Let's just get right into it. I know we've landed on 5. Maybe we can talk about the process leading up to that. Yeah. What were we looking at? How did we distill down to 5? Why did we pick these 5? I'll let you guys run with that.
Yeah, so we're working with a consultant, the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness, CREC. There's another acronym for you. And so we worked with them because, like I said, Jeff and I have done a lot of research on industry clusters, and we brought in a consultant to kind of help us really dive deeper into the industry clusters in Missouri, what they look like. So we started that kind of first phase of the assessment with CREC, really data-driven. What are the largest clusters in Missouri in terms of GDP growth, employment? To do that, we looked at the U.S. Harvard mapping database, which I think that was done by Michael Porter as well. Again, Godfather. Nothing happens in industry clusters without his say-so. That's a database that a lot of people use, and it is kind of like a one-size-fits-all. It'll take a bunch of smaller industries and then package them together and say, this is aerospace vehicle defense cluster, right? So we use that database to identify the top 20 clusters in Missouri, just on a kind of a data level. And from there, we created profiles and just kind of mapped them across Missouri. Where are they in Missouri? Who are the top employers? Who are the top educational providers? And then from there, that's when we started looking at that and then trying to narrow down to 5.
Before we get into revealing the top 5, like this is like some kind
I didn't
of
anticipate this being so.
It's like an award show or something. We're gonna get to it eventually. Just a quick.
We should have a representative from each cluster and we can give them a little trophy or something.
Yeah. Just a quick question that popped into my mind, and I think we were kind of mentioning it earlier when we were talking about what is a cluster, but like what makes a cluster a cluster? You know, like I know we're like similar, you know, similarities or sharing a lot of resources and all that stuff. But if there's like 3 businesses that are near each other, does that make a cluster? Does it have to be like a certain number? Does it have to be a certain size? Like what makes a cluster a cluster?
I think that is subjective. I think there's a really good Brookings Institute, and I think is like a cluster is you know it when you see it. So it's a bit subjective just in terms of size and in terms of like what it looks like, because that definition I gave that these are related industries that are co-located, that's the definition, you know. Okay. So like, no, I mean there's great research papers and stuff that go deeper and they try to define it better, but it is subjective about what that means to be interconnected and sharing resources. And like what I said, the U.S. The Harvard mapping, they take these NAICS codes, these industries, and according to them, these are related industries. When they are around each other, they give each other, an economic, advantage, competitive advantage.
Oftentimes they'll share a workforce or the need for certain skill sets that, the job may change from industry to industry, but within that cluster, they need this type of, skill and the inputs, the raw inputs from. I'm sure we'll talk more about the value chain later, but what type of products go into this good or service that's being provided in this cluster. There's going to be some overlap there. Again, they're not hand in glove identical, but they'll be similar.
Gotcha. So what are the 5 industry clusters that we're using for our CEDS development?
So after a great drum roll. No, so our 5 industry clusters that we selected, and I'll name them and then talk about the process to go so we can stop belaboring. So we have transportation and defense, which is our automotive, aerospace centered cluster. Advanced materials, which is critical minerals and like this the central part of the state, as well as like battery manufacturing, and that's really strong in the southwest part of the state, and chemical manufacturing. Food and beverage processing that Jeff had already kind of alluded to, kind of spoiled it, this moment where we reveal it.
Yeah, I didn't know we were doing the drum roll.
Food and beverage, that's the value-added agriculture, and that's obviously a huge strength for our state. Biotechnology, which really captures a lot of, that's one of those emerging clusters that Jeff was talking about. We really see it in the metros right now, but we see a lot of synergies on how that plays into agriculture and industries in the rural parts of our communities. But that, when you hear that, think of like the Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis, the Animal Health Corridor in Kansas City, and then finally finance and insurance, which again, we see a lot of like in Columbia and in Kansas City. To get there, like I said, we had 20 industry clusters, and I'll try to make this short. It was kind of a cool process to be a part of, but so we had an advisory group made up of DED experts and outside experts, and CREC interviewed a lot of stakeholders, local, regional, statewide economic developers, industry associations, and educational institutions, and took this, here are the top 20 clusters. Is this what it looks like in Missouri? And we'll talk about this when we did like our CEDS workshop, but a really important part of data work is to talk to experts and see like, is this Missouri? Do these clusters fit Missouri? And through a lot of the interviews and through more data work, we really saw that like those top 20 clusters weren't necessarily reflective of what Missouri was. Like, for example, those top 20 clusters, they have automotive and aerospace as 2 different clusters. Kind of to your point, like according to that Harvard mapping, those are separate. But when we talked to stakeholders and when we looked at the data, we saw that a lot of suppliers in St. Louis and Kansas City supply to both automotive and aerospace companies. So even though they produce 2 different things, airplanes and cars, they actually share a lot of workers. They share a lot of suppliers. So we decided in with CREC that those should be the same cluster for us. Because again, like that one size fits all of the top 20, an automotive cluster in Missouri looks a lot different than the automotive cluster in Michigan, right? So from those 20, we actually expanded it to 27. We started kind of mixing and combining some of those clusters so that they fit Missouri. And so those 5 are combinations and take some industries from other clusters so that, again, because that's more reflective of what our Missouri industries are. And so when we did that, we looked at the industries that had the most economic impact on our state. And so we looked at, what percent of the GDP are they? How many Missourians do they employ? Because we want to make sure that these clusters represent a large part of our workforce. Are we specialized in it? Looking at like location quotient, and are we going to continue to be specialized in it? Are they going to continue to be a big part of our economy? And at the end of the day, in terms of data, these 5 industry clusters represent 1 in 11 jobs of all of Missouri jobs and account for 15% of our GDP and are geographically spread across the state, which is really important to us to make sure that these were economically significant, but also every region of the state may not have every cluster in their region, but they would see themselves in at least a couple of them.
Earlier, we were mentioning the tour where you guys were going around and talking and getting this kind of feedback. Beyond kind of some of the anecdotes that you were kind of dropping earlier, Jeff, what other kind of things were you guys hearing? I mean, you had mentioned like, when we're in this section, they were saying, hey, this is what drives our economy and whatnot. But can you kind of go in a little deeper about some of the conversations that were being had and what you guys were hearing from these listening tours?
Sure. I think one of the things that came out to me when folks were talking about their regional economy and their regional strengths, I think there was overall good buy-in and good understanding of what we're trying to do with these 5 industry clusters. Even if they didn't mesh with their 5 top industry clusters, they could see that these statewide are potential drivers. And again, buying into that, okay, well, if this industry grows and it helps grow, St. Louis, we have suppliers here that will benefit from that. It's that rising tide lifting all boats type of thing. I think we did get really good feedback in the end from that. And I thought, we got into what can we do to foster these in your region? What can we do to grow these industries and make sure they're continuing to grow? I thought we got really good feedback there. A lot of folks understanding grasping the workforce issue, and population growth is kind of slowing a little bit, so it's going to be a challenge for us in the future dealing with workforce, finding workers. So what do we need to do to make sure that we're getting the most out of the workforce that we have, and bringing in our colleagues from education, from 4-year and 2-year schools, making sure that high schools are giving their students the understanding what kind of jobs are available in Missouri and what kind of career that you can have through that. Just feedback from that, again, buying into it and then being active on, okay, what do we do? How do we roll up our sleeves and get to work to make sure this industry grows in Missouri? I think was 2 of the key takeaways I took away, Stefan.
Yeah, for sure. And Jeff hit on this, that when we did 8 workshops across the state, and it was really important to us that, like I said about data, and you have to ground truth it. It was really important to us not to just go to these cities and present like, hey, here are our 5 industry clusters. Didn't we do such a great job? It was kind of like, and we were proud of what we did. And like CREC did a good job, and we put a lot of research into this, and we're really confident about these 5 clusters, but we also wanted to leave a lot of room to first present on them and then say, is this reflective of your regional local economy? And as Jeff said, we got a lot of feedback on that. One of the feedback, we got early on was about the agriculture, and that kind of helped us throughout the rest of the CEDS workshops. And as we develop this report, is to be really intentional about how these clusters impact agriculture, like food and beverage manufacturing. That's a big part of value-added agriculture. And then like biotechnology and the research, and even like transportation and defense. You have geospatial technology being used in agriculture and like crop planning and things like that. And so that was really good feedback for us to immediately understand, like, we need to make sure that these clusters, even if they're not directly labeled as agriculture or other top industries of our state, that we can communicate and show that they have impact. These clusters have impacts of our top industries.
When we're talking about the clusters being used for CEDS, like, how is that information being used specifically to influence the CEDS strategy? I mean, yeah, we get like, hey, we got 5 industries, here are the industries, but how does that actually influence it in all of that?
That's a great question. That's always the most important part of data and research is, how do you use it afterwards? And we're like right in the thick of that right now. And we're finishing up the research, and now we're looking on like, how do we give this legs, and how do we use this? And we want to use this. So first of all, as Danielle said in episode 1, our CEDS will have an economic background. And as we saw through this research, that these industry clusters do play a large part of our, economic story as a state. It'll, be in our economic background, and it's broken down at a regional level. And we've gotten a lot of feedback, both before and after those workshops, that our local partners say, hey, if you're going to do this statewide cluster, analysis, can you show the data on a regional level so we can understand and we can strategize, we can base our strategies off of that. And we did that. So just as a resource, if people, were part of the workshops, they read the report, and these clusters are representative of their region, they can just use the data at a regional level and strategize around that. And then one of the early feedback we got is, for these industry clusters, there's more than 2 options, but the feedback kind of boiled it down of, are you going to market these? Which is a thing that, Eric, your point to what other states like Ohio and Michigan, I think they do a good job of they just use it to market. Say, hey, here are our top industries. And a big thing about clusters and an advantage that I didn't talk about was they can be an attraction tool, right? If people born in England, Missouri, or New York, if they're into tech or want to develop an app, they're going to learn early on. They might have to move to Silicon Valley, right? That statement might not be as true as it was 20 years ago, but still, industry clusters draw people to your region, draw people to your state, and importantly, businesses. So just marketing them, hey, look what's here in Missouri. In Missouri, we have world-class institutions and businesses, and it's a great thing to market that, to get workers and to get businesses here. And then the other option is to think of policies and programs that we have or could have that could empower these clusters. And as episode 1 talked about, there's a working teams for our CEDS and business development, community infrastructure, talent, and innovation. And they're going to be reviewing this as well. And they're going to look at if there's some strategies over the next 5 years that, we could employ to empower these clusters.
One thing that I see when I look at these clusters, they look very much Missouri. There's agriculture base with food and bev and biotech, finance, that's a big industry for us, finance and insurance, big in St. Louis, Columbia with insurance. We have 2 Federal Reserve banks in the state. So those things drive us forward. So I see Missouri when I look at these clusters, but these are also very forward-looking and very tech-based types of businesses. We're talking about advanced materials. That is pulling materials out of the ground, but this is more than, how do we process those? How do we get those into high-tech equipment and machinery? Doing that in the state. Biotechnology is obviously a place, Stefan mentioned our assets there, where we have an opportunity to be known for as a state, a biotech hub, a place where you go, decisions are being made in that industry in Missouri. Finance and insurance as well. It's more than just hand-to-hand, shaking a hand type of relationship, but there's also fintech involved in this and how important that is. Again, another industry that's important, but also has a very forward-looking view to it. So I think what I'm really satisfied when I look at these clusters is I see ourselves in it, but I also see growth and opportunity in all of them as well.
You guys look at this kind of data day in, day out. Like you said, when you look at something, you go, that looks like Missouri. During this process, was there anything that kind of surprised you guys when you looked at it where you go, oh, that's interesting. We didn't see it going in that direction? Or was it more like, oh, that's Missouri. That's kind of what we thought was going to happen?
And this may just be more ignorance on my part and not understanding the industry, but you look at mining as in Missouri, and it's a pretty small sector relative to the others. But in researching it and talking with experts in it, how it could grow and how it could become something much, much larger and much more significant and much more, again, I'll go back to the technical cutting edge type of research that can be done here. Talking with our friends at Missouri S&T and some of the ideas they have about this industry and what it could be for Missouri into battery manufacturing and semiconductors manufacturing and the like. When I first saw that industry, my thought was, well, this is great. There's a part of the state that mining is more important, and let's foster this and grow that part of the state. But I think this has huge potential to be a major driver for Missouri's economy as well. So that's one of the, I think, the surprises that I had as I researched it more, but the great potential there.
That was the same as me. The advanced materials, when we had identified that kind of in the data, and then we started looking at, okay, statewide, this is strong, right? And as Jeff said about like the tech hub, we knew that we were strong in certain parts of the state. But when we started mapping it out geographically, it was actually one of the most geographically representative industry clusters across, only behind like transportation and defense, which that was what we had expected, and food and beverage. But just how many regions had some presence in advanced materials, again, even outside critical minerals, about the batteries, battery manufacturing, storage, chemical manufacturing. That was surprising to me. And that was probably a little bit of my ignorance of like kind of the things that are going on in parts of the state I don't go to as much, like in the north and kind of upper central part of the state, but they were pretty strong in advanced materials. And I think when we were up there, some of them were surprised, that they were so strong in that. But then when we asked them the kind of employers to look for, they're like, oh yeah, like those are anchor employers in our region, and like those are major players in a statewide cluster that, we want to be a like really important nationally.
So we've wrapped up the tour, and I say wrapped up in the context of when we're recording. It's been wrapped up several months ago, but just in the context of how this story is unfolding on this podcast, we've wrapped up the tour. We've gathered lots of data. I'm sure you guys are still gathering data. Where are you guys at right now with what you have on your plate?
So right now we are working with CREC to finalize the industry cluster report. We are still like looking at the data, but the data work is pretty much already done. Now it's just putting it in a narrative, then looking at that. Eric, you kind of touched on this. Those next steps in the report I believe we're calling them like strategic considerations. And those are things that we want our working teams for the CEDS to look at. So yeah, the next steps is to, how are we going to use this data? How are we going to use these industry cluster profiles for a statewide strategy or regional strategies?
And that report, beyond just CEDS, is that useful in any other context of like, hey, we have this great report of all this information. We're going to use it for CEDS, but we can use it for XYZ as well?
I think so. Like I said, in terms of like marketing, this is really good data, and this is really good mapping of these industry clusters. Jeff kind of touched on this. We did like a value chain mapping of these clusters, kind of showing like where the inputs are, where the outputs are. Those are things that local community members can use. Those are things that if people are trying to attract businesses to their region and they don't know what type of businesses they should target, that's just that's a resource out there that they can use to, okay, what cluster industry am I strong in? My region, how strong are we? What are the assets that we have? And that's something you could use to market, just for your information as you're talking about business recruitment.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. A good sign of a good research report is if it prompts more questions, and it prompts our regions to ask those questions. Okay, where do we fit in detail, and what type of skills do we need to work on to make sure that we're a player in that? I think a good report leads to more research, and I kind of get a sense that people will buy into this and see this is good for the state, and then we'll want to work towards improving. Again, all industries are important. All industries are driving us forward. But if you're looking to help grow your region and grow the state's economy, these 5 industries are towards the top in terms of helping you to look forward and what you need to do to grow, continue to grow.
Stefan, you had mentioned next steps is, hey, let's look at this data. Let's see how we can implement it, use it for the CEDS. Once all of that, the dust of that has settled, and we're in kind of the home stretch of, okay, it's done, now it's being implemented, it's 5 years. How does the data and research, how does that continue through those 5 years?
That's a good question. And I think it remains to be seen. Again, that kind of goes back to those programs and policies. Like, do we continue to monitor is not the right word. Do we continue to research these industry clusters and keep like with this specific cluster definition? Because there's industry cluster studies done all across Missouri, and it's how they want to define a cluster. But if these are like the 5 that we want to continue researching, and do we want to update this every year? Do we want to do more targeted outreach to businesses, right? Because I believe in the final report, we ended up talking to over 30 businesses that were related to these industry clusters to get on the ground truths. I mean, there's much more than 33 businesses in these. Do we want to continue that? I think ultimately that's up to the CEDS working teams and what they're working on, like what kind of strategic options come out of their work. And also just, the value from our local and regional stakeholders. If they have value from this and they want more research to be done or more actions to be done, I think that once we have the final report and hopefully we get feedback on it, we'll know more.
We could continue to talk about the data, the research, industry clusters. I'm sure you guys are just a wealth of knowledge because you guys look at this day in and day out. But I'm kind of out of questions in regards to it. So I'll just ask you guys open-endedly, is there anything related to anything that we've talked about that we should dive into that we didn't, or that you would think listeners would want to know that we didn't cover yet?
I want to play off of what Stefan just said and what's next. I think this exercise was really helpful as a method or as a way to go about this, because as we all know, the economy is changing very quickly, and that pace of change is going to continue to accelerate in time as time goes on. So had we done this 10 years ago, I think some of these clusters would probably been on our list, but some of them probably wouldn't. And 10 years from now, maybe, it looks a lot different. So I think this process we went through, we learned a lot about our state's economy. I think we can do have some actionable steps to take from this process. But I also think the process maybe helps us to understand what we need to do in the future to, new data in, new economy to deal with. What does this look like now? And I think hopefully we can use this as a model for that going forward as well.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to come in. I know it's very busy. You're probably swamped with data, and I'm sure you're going to be diving back into it with enthusiasm once we're done here. But thank you so much for coming on and giving us all this good information. Hopefully the listeners are getting a lot of valuable stuff out of the CEDS talk. We have more coming, so stay tuned. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Eric.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Inside Eco Devo. We have great episodes coming your way every 2 weeks, so be sure to subscribe. Also, we want to hear from you, our listeners. Tell us what economic development topics you want to hear more about. This helps us fulfill our motto of helping Missourians prosper by bringing content to our listeners that they want to hear. Leave a comment on an episode or send an email to ded.communications@ded.mo.gov and stay tuned for more Inside Eco Devo.